I and my father have been camping since I was 4. Although my mom was never interested in it, I and my father made it a habit to go camping at least every 3 months. By the time I was in high school, we had found a private camping area which was at the foot of the Alps. This place was perfect for camping, as it was safe, not too far from home, and we could easily acquire the basic necessities required for camping there. Dad and I wasted no time and drove to our favorite camping spot. However, this year, the place was crowded. Even though it was a big clearing in the forest, many campers had already set their camps before we had arrived. As Dad and I had been hiking and camping for decades now, we weren't afraid to set our camp a bit further from the others. We ended up setting up our camp a little too deep into the woods. The ground there was uneven, and it was a bit of a struggle to set the tents. But I and Dad managed anyways. We planned to set our camp in the morning, then go for a long hike. Later return to our camp, have dinner, and sleep. The next day we would repeat the same schedule, but skip dinner to return home by nightfall. Our hike went as planned. Rather, I would say it was one of the best days of my life. Due to my college and my dad's busy life, we hardly got time for each other. When we returned to our tents after sunset, Dad and I set up a campfire, made some sandwiches for dinner, and slept. Now you need to know that we do not carry our big tents for these 1 or 2 day hikes. Instead, we bring small tents that just fit our upper body when we sleep in them, while our feet rest outside. Around 2 a.m., I was suddenly woken up by shuffling noise and footsteps around our campsite. The noise came from the small table we had set up to keep our hiking gear and other necessities we couldn't fit inside our tents. I thought it might be my dad. He often gets up to relieve himself at night due to diabetes. The shuffling noise continued, but I dismissed the matter and tried to sleep. However, after minutes of unsuccessful attempts, I decided to talk to my dad and ask him what he was up to. That's when the shuffling noise stopped. I guessed my dad had found whatever he was looking for and would go to his tent to sleep now. Instead of the footsteps going to my dad's tent, I could hear them coming closer to mine. I froze still and decided not to make a move and pretend to sleep. The footsteps came around my tent and stood behind it. Whoever the person was, he had a tall frame and was pretty broad by what I could tell. He stood behind my tent, still as a tree for a couple of minutes. Then he bent down and started sniffing my feet. It was super weird, and even though I was stark awake, I pretended to sleep. I slowly retracted my exposed legs into the tent and curled up into a ball. Then the man circled my tent twice and would sniff it from time to time. I was panicking inside my tent, sweating despite it being cool at night. The man finally noticed that my tent was open and did the unthinkable. He bent down and peeked into my tent. His face was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. And the worst part was, he wasn't a man at all. He was something between a man and an animal. He had big, bulging eyes, a flat nose, and a mouth full of sharp teeth. He must have sensed my fear. That's why he reached a long, muscular hand inside my tent and grabbed my ankle. I screamed and tried to kick his hand away, but he was too strong for me. He pulled me out of the tent, and I was struggling to free myself when suddenly something hit the forest man on his head. It was Dad. He had picked up the wooden chair and slammed it into the wild man's head. For a brief time, he lost his footing, enough for me to free myself and re-enter my tent. I went inside and saw my trekking pole standing in a corner. I picked it up and ran out. Dad was still fighting the wild man when I did the most horrifying thing in my life. I stabbed my dad's attacker in the back with the pointy end of my trekking pole. He screeched and thrashed to get the pole out of him. This was enough for me to grab our car keys, get Dad, and run toward the campground in the pitch darkness. Once we passed the camp, we continued towards our car in the parking lot. I took the wheel and it drove us home. We never returned to the camp after that. But a couple of days later, the park rangers discovered the mutilated body of the animal man who had attacked us. I had killed him. When his body was taken to the lab for research, it was all over the news that 35 years ago, a renowned scientist had done some genetic experiments on a baby boy, which had turned him into an animal. The details of the experiment were confidential, but after the death of the scientists, this humanoid creature had roamed the wilderness, preying on animals. My dad and I were unfortunate enough to become his targets that night. It scares me how haunted and cruel people could be under the pretext of science. The fact that I had killed this humanoid will stay with me forever, but I can never forget the sheer terror he made me feel that night.